The diplomatic shuttle Silent Observer drifted through the asteroid field like a ghost made of metal and circuitry. Zektar pressed his four-fingered hand against the observation deck's transparent aluminum viewport, his compound eyes adjusting to track the debris floating past. Each piece of shattered rock told a story of violence that had happened here just days before. Initial contact protocols established, Observer Zektar, announced Commander Thrix from the navigation pod. Her voice carried the typical metallic undertone of the mechanized coalition species, but there was something else there today: uncertainty. The human fleet has agreed to allow our documentation of their upcoming engagement with the Zarathi invasion force. Zektar's mandibles clicked softly, a sound his species made when processing complex information. In his 300 years of documenting galactic conflicts, he had never seen anything quite like the intelligence reports about these creatures called humans. They were a young species, barely having achieved faster-than-light travel 50 years ago, yet they had somehow managed to halt the advance of the Zarathi collective, the same force that had swept through 12 star systems in the past year without meaningful resistance. What do we know about their tactical approach? Zektar asked, pulling up holographic displays on his personal interface. The data streams showed fleet compositions, energy signatures, and battle formations from their previous encounters. That's the concerning part, replied Thrix, her mechanical limbs adjusting the ship's position with precise movements. Their tactical approach appears to have no logical foundation. Our combat analysis algorithms can't predict their battle patterns. They use formations that should result in complete annihilation, employ strategies that violate basic principles of space warfare, and somehow achieve victory rates that are mathematically improbable. Zektar studied the tactical readouts more carefully. The humans fielded ships that were technologically inferior to most galactic standard vessels. Their weapons systems were crude compared to the plasma cannons and quantum disruptors used by advanced civilizations. Their shield technology was primitive, their armor plating looked like it belonged in a museum, and their overall ship design seemed to prioritize function over efficiency in ways that made no strategic sense. Look at this, Zektar muttered, highlighting a section of the data. Their primary battlecruiser, the Indomitable, has section of its hull that appears to be welded scrap metal? And these energy signatures suggest they're running their reactors at power levels that should cause immediate meltdown. The mysteries multiply, agreed Thrix. Our preliminary observations suggest they have no standardized doctrine, no unified command structure that follows recognized military hierarchies, and their communication during battle consists largely of what our translators can only interpret as primitive emotional outbursts and aggressive vocalizations. The viewport suddenly filled with light as the human fleet came into visual range. Zektar had to adjust his optical filters to compensate for the blazing engines and external lighting systems that covered every human vessel. Where other species built their ships with smooth, efficient lines and energy-conserving designs, human ships looked like someone had taken functional components and welded them together with determination rather than engineering precision. The flagship Indomitable was a massive vessel that seemed to be constructed from at least 17 different ship classes. Its hull bore scorch marks from previous battles that the humans had apparently chosen not to repair, instead wearing them like decorative scars. Weapons platforms jutted out from every conceivable surface, many of them clearly jury-rigged installations that no proper military engineer would approve. Observer Zektar, came a new voice through the communication array, speaking in heavily accented galactic standard. This is Admiral Sarah Martinez of the Terran Defense Force. We're honored to have the Vorthak Observation Corps document this engagement. Fair warning though, things might get a little chaotic out here. Zektar activated his recording systems and opened a communication channel. Admiral Martinez, we appreciate your cooperation. May I ask about your strategic assessment of the incoming Zarathi force? There was a pause, followed by what his translators identified as laughter, an emotional response that seemed inappropriate given the circumstances. Strategic assessment? Well, observer, they've got us outgunned about 3-1, their ships are faster than ours, their shields are stronger, and their weapons have longer range. By any reasonable analysis, we're completely screwed. This was not the response Zektar had expected from a commanding officer facing imminent battle. Then, what is your plan for achieving victory? Plan? The human's voice carried what seemed to be amusement. The plan is simple. We're going to charge straight at them, get in close where our weapons can do some damage, and make them regret ever coming to our neighborhood. Sometimes the best strategy is to do something so insane that the enemy can't predict it. Zektar looked at Thrix, whose mechanical features somehow conveyed bewilderment. In all their documentation of galactic warfare, they had never encountered a military commander who openly acknowledged being outmatched and responded with apparent enthusiasm rather than strategic recalculation. Admiral, our tactical analysis suggests that a direct assault against superior forces would result in complete fleet destruction within approximately 14 minutes of engagement.
Sounds about right, Martinez replied cheerfully. That gives us 14 minutes to win this thing. Should be plenty of time.
The communication ended, leaving Zektar staring at his instruments in confusion. He began checking his translation software, wondering if some critical nuance of human language was being lost in the conversion to galactic standard. No species approached warfare with this combination of apparent recklessness and inexplicable confidence.
Beginning detailed observation protocols, Zektar announced to his recording systems.
Subject: human military engagement with Sarathi collective forces.
Initial assessment: human strategic thinking appears to be fundamentally incompatible with established military doctrine. Through the viewport, the human fleet began to move.
Instead of forming the defensive formations that any reasonable commander would employ when facing superior forces, the human ships spread out in what looked like a completely random pattern. Some ships accelerated toward the enemy, others seemed to be positioning themselves at angles that would make mutual support impossible, and several vessels were actually moving away from the main battle area entirely. Their formation makes no sense, observed Thrix, running calculations on her combat prediction algorithms. They're eliminating their own tactical advantages and exposing themselves to concentrated fire from multiple angles. Zektar was about to respond when proximity alarms began sounding across the human fleet. The Zarathi invasion force had arrived at the edge of the system, their sleek crystalline ships emerging from hyperspace in perfect geometric formations. The Zarathi were known for their mathematical precision in warfare, treating each battle like a complex equation to be solved through superior technology and flawless execution. The contrast was startling. Where the human ships looked like improvised weapons cobbled together from spare parts, the Zarathi vessels were works of art: smooth crystal surfaces that seemed to bend light around them, weapons platforms that moved with mechanical perfection, and shield systems that created shimmering barriers around each ship. Zarathi battle formation confirmed, reported Thrix. 67 heavy cruisers, 23 dreadnought-class vessels, and what appears to be a command ship that's larger than anything in our databases. They're assuming standard engagement positions at maximum weapons range. Zektar watched as the Zarathi fleet settled into a formation that his tactical training immediately recognized as optimal for their technology advantage. They would use their superior range to wear down the human fleet before the humans could get close enough to use their apparently inferior weapons. It was a textbook example of how advanced civilizations dealt with technologically primitive opponents.
But the humans weren't responding according to the textbook.
Instead of attempting to close distance gradually while minimizing casualties, or trying to find cover among the asteroids, or even attempting to retreat to a more defensible position, the human ships suddenly accelerated directly toward the Zarathi formation at maximum speed. "They're charging straight at them," Thrix said in disbelief. No evasive maneuvers, no attempt at tactical positioning, no coordination between ship groups.
They're just running directly into superior firepower.
Zektar began recording more frantically, his compound eyes tracking multiple data streams simultaneously. This was either going to be the most spectacular military disaster in galactic history, or he was about to witness something that would rewrite everything military scholars thought they knew about space combat.
The Zarathi response was exactly what any military analyst would predict.
Their crystal ships opened fire with precise, coordinated volleys that created a wall of plasma and energy beams designed to annihilate anything that attempted to pass through it. The mathematical beauty of their attack pattern was something that would be studied in military academies for generations if there was anyone left to study it. The human response was to fly straight into that wall of death, ships blazing with engine fire and external lights, broadcasting what Zektar's translators were now identifying as music alongside aggressive vocalizations that seemed to serve no tactical purpose whatsoever. "This is madness," whispered Thrix, her mechanical voice processing frequencies of disbelief that Zektar had never heard before. But, as the first human ships entered the Zarathi kill zone, something impossible began to happen. Instead of being vaporized by the overwhelming firepower, they started to weave through the plasma beams with movements that defied both physics and logic. Ships that should have been destroyed were somehow still flying, their hulls glowing red-hot from near misses, but their weapon systems still operational. Zektar realized his mandibles were clicking rapidly, an unconscious response to information that his brain couldn't properly process.
How are they surviving that barrage?
Unknown, replied Thrix, her instruments struggling to track the chaotic movements of the human fleet.
Their ships appear to be making course corrections that our computers can't predict. It's like they're responding to threats before our sensors can even detect the attack patterns.
The lead human ship, a battered cruiser that looked like it had been through dozen previous battles, suddenly rolled inverted and accelerated upward relative to the galactic plane, diving through a gap in the Zarathi formation that shouldn't have existed. As it passed between two crystal dreadnoughts, it unleashed a barrage of kinetic projectiles, primitive metal slugs that no advanced civilization had used for centuries. Those primitive metal slugs punched through crystal shielding that could deflect plasma cannons. Impossible, Zektar breathed, watching his instruments confirm what his eyes were seeing. Their projectile weapons are penetrating Zarathi's shields.
How is that possible?
Thrix was running rapid calculations, her mechanical mind processing the data faster than Zektar's organic brain could follow.
The Zarathi shields are calibrated to deflect energy-based attacks. Their designers never considered the possibility that anyone would still be using kinetic weapons in modern space combat. The shields are letting the projectiles pass through because they don't recognize them as threats.
More human ships were breaking through the Zarathi lines now, each one following a different path that seemed to be improvised on the spot. Instead of coordinated battle formations, each human ship appeared to be making independent decisions based on immediate circumstances. It should have been a recipe for disaster, but instead it was creating a level of unpredictability that was overwhelming the Zarathi tactical computers. Zektar watched a small human fighter craft, barely larger than a shuttle, somehow position itself behind a Zarathi dreadnought and begin targeting what appeared to be decorative crystal formations on the ship's hull. The targeting made no sense until those decorative crystals began exploding in cascading failures that brought down entire sections of the dreadnought's shielding.
They're targeting aesthetic elements, Zektar realized.
The Zarathi integrate their shield generators into their ship's artistic design. The humans somehow recognized that what looks like decoration is actually critical ship systems.
But how could they know that? Asked Thrix. The Zarathi design philosophy is completely alien to human thinking.
There's no way they could have analyzed their ships in enough detail to identify those vulnerabilities. The answer came from an unexpected source, the human communications channel, which was still broadcasting their music and aggressive vocalizations. But, listening more carefully, Zektar began to recognize patterns in the chaos. The humans weren't just shouting random emotions at each other. They were sharing real-time tactical information through what could only be described as emotional combat communication.
"Target the pretty crystals," came one voice. "The sparkly bits blow up real nice."
"Got a big one coming around from starboard," called another. "He's trying to look tough, but his backside's all lit up like a festival." "Dance with me, you crystal bastard," shouted a third voice, followed by sounds that Zektar's translator couldn't process but somehow conveyed both aggression and joy.
Zektar realized he was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic military history.
The humans weren't following tactical doctrine because they had developed their own entirely different approach to warfare, one based on intuition, improvisation, and emotional communication rather than mathematical precision and technological superiority.
And, somehow, impossibly, it was working.
The Zarathi formation was beginning to collapse as human ships swarmed through their lines like angry insects, each one finding weaknesses that shouldn't have been detectable and exploiting them with weapons that shouldn't have been effective. The mathematical perfection of crystal warfare was being undone by the chaotic unpredictability of human combat instincts. But Zektar knew this was only the beginning. The real battle was yet to come, and he was about to witness something that would change his understanding of warfare forever. The battle had been raging for exactly 7 minutes and 34 seconds when Zektar witnessed something that violated every principle of space combat he had learned in his 3 centuries of observation. A human destroyer, the Relentless Fury, had somehow maneuvered itself between 2 Zarathi heavy cruisers and was engaging both of them simultaneously while flying in a pattern that could only be described as a 3-dimensional spiral. "Their pilot must be dead," muttered Thrix, her mechanical sensors struggling to track the ship's impossible movements. No biological nervous system can process spatial information fast enough to maintain those flight patterns under combat stress. But the human communications channel told a different story entirely. "Yavu, did you see that shot bounce right off their fancy shields?" came the voice of the Relentless Fury's pilot, accompanied by what Zektar's translator identified as laughter mixed with aggressive satisfaction. "Their crystals are pretty, but they can't handle good old-fashioned human stubbornness." Zektar realized his breathing apparatus was working overtime, a biological response his species experienced when encountering incomprehensible phenomena. The human pilot wasn't just surviving the impossible maneuvers, they were enjoying them. More disturbing still, the pilot seemed to be treating the deadly combat situation as some form of competitive entertainment. "Admiral Martinez," Zektar opened a communication channel, "your destroyer is performing maneuvers that should be killing its crew through gravitational stress. How is this possible?" The response came immediately, with background sounds of what appeared to be controlled explosions and more of that inexplicable human laughter. "Oh, that's just Rodriguez showing off. He used to race atmospheric fighters through canyon systems for fun before joining the military. Compared to threading a needle between canyon walls at hypersonic speeds while drunk, this is practically relaxing." Zektar checked his translation software again, certain that critical information was being lost. The human had just claimed that their pilot found deadly space combat less stressful than recreational activities they performed while intoxicated. This suggested that human recreational pursuits were more dangerous than warfare, a concept that broke several fundamental assumptions about biological survival instincts. But the tactical implications were becoming clear. The Zarathi had designed their combat doctrine around the assumption that enemy pilots would behave rationally, following predictable flight patterns based on technological limitations and survival instincts. Human pilots were apparently following neither technological limitations nor survival instincts, making their movements impossible for Zarathi targeting computers to predict. The Relentless Fury suddenly executed a maneuver that Zektar's instruments identified as physically impossible. The ship appeared to stop its forward momentum instantaneously and reverse direction without any visible thruster activity. The pursuing Zarathi cruisers overshot their target, and the human destroyer proceeded to rake their crystal hulls with concentrated kinetic fire. "How did they achieve that velocity change?" demanded Thrix, her mechanical voice rising to frequencies that indicated severe processing strain. "Our sensors show no propulsion signature capable of generating those forces." The answer came from an unexpected source. Another human voice joined the communications channel, this one identifying itself as the chief engineer of the Relentant Fury. "Rodriguez, you maniac. That emergency reverse burn just cost us half our reactor coolant. We can't pull that trick again." "No problem, Chief," came the pilot's cheerful response. "I've got 17 more completely untested maneuvers I've been wanting to try out. This is the best day ever." Zektar was beginning to understand something profound and terrifying about human psychology. These creatures seemed to derive positive emotional stimulation from situations that should trigger survival responses. Rather than being paralyzed by fear or driven to seek safety, humans appeared to become more creative and aggressive when faced with overwhelming odds. Across the battlefield, other human ships were demonstrating similar patterns. A heavy cruiser had somehow positioned itself upside down relative to the galactic plane and was firing its weapons in directions that created a spinning web of destruction around a cluster of Zarathi vessels. A squadron of human fighters had formed what appeared to be a completely random formation that was nonetheless keeping 3 enemy dreadnoughts from achieving clear targeting solutions. "Observer Zektar," came Admiral Martinez's voice again, "you might want to pay attention to what's happening near the asteroid cluster. We're about to try something that's either brilliant or completely insane." Zektar redirected his primary sensors toward the cluster of asteroids where the battle had begun. Several human ships were maneuvering among the rocks in patterns that seemed designed to attract Zarathi fire rather than avoid it. The enemy responded predictably, concentrating their attacks on what appeared to be vulnerable human vessels caught in the asteroid field. But, as the Zarathi plasma beams struck the asteroids, something unexpected began to happen. The rocks weren't just being destroyed, they were being shattered in specific patterns that created clouds of metallic debris. And those clouds were forming geometric shapes that looked almost like. "They're creating a defensive barrier," Thrix said in amazement. "They're using enemy weapons fire to shatter asteroids in precise patterns to create cover for their ships." But that wasn't the end of it. As more asteroids were destroyed, the debris clouds began to interact with the Zarathi energy weapons in ways that created spectacular light shows and electromagnetic interference. The precision targeting that the crystal ships relied on was being disrupted by the very environment the humans had manipulated their enemies into creating. "This is impossible," Zektar whispered. "They're using their enemy's superior technology against them by manipulating the battlefield environment in real time. The level of spatial calculation required to predict debris patterns and electromagnetic interactions is beyond what most civilizations can achieve with dedicated computer systems." "Oh, that's not calculation," came Admiral Martinez's voice, apparently monitoring their observation channel. "That's pure instinct. Humans have been throwing rocks at things we don't like for about 2 million years. We've got pretty good at predicting how rocks behave when you break them." The implications hit Zektar like a plasma cannon to his consciousness. Humans weren't using advanced tactical computers to achieve these impossible feats. They were relying on evolutionary instincts developed over millions of years of survival on what must have been an extraordinarily dangerous planet. Their brains had evolved to make split-second calculations about projectile physics, environmental manipulation, and threat assessment because their very survival had depended on these abilities. Meanwhile, the battle was taking on characteristics that no military academy in the galaxy had ever considered possible. Human ships were now working together in ways that defied formal coordination but achieved perfect tactical synchronization. Without any apparent communication or predetermined planning, they were forming attack patterns that supported each other while maintaining the chaotic unpredictability that kept the Zarathi off balance. A group of 5 human cruisers had somehow managed to surround a Zarathi dreadnought in a 3-dimensional formation that allowed each ship to cover the other's vulnerable angles while maintaining continuous fire on their target. But the formation wasn't static, it was flowing and changing in real time, adapting to the enemy's responses faster than any command structure should have been able to coordinate. How are they achieving tactical coordination without centralized command? Zektar asked. Same way a flock of birds flies together, replied Admiral Martinez. Or a school of fish avoids predators. Or a pack of wolves brings down prey. Humans evolved as social hunters, observer. We don't need someone telling us how to work together when we're focused on the same goal. Zektar realized he was documenting something that would fundamentally change galactic understanding of warfare. Every military doctrine he had studied was based on the assumption that effective combat required either technological superiority or superior organization and planning. Humans had apparently developed a third option: combat effectiveness, based on evolved biological capabilities that allowed them to function as a coordinated organism without formal coordination. The Zarathi were beginning to show signs of tactical confusion. Their crystal ships were designed to engage enemies that followed predictable patterns based on technological capabilities and logical decision-making. Against opponents who combined primitive technology with impossible maneuvers and coordinated chaos, their mathematical approach to warfare was proving inadequate. But the humans weren't finished demonstrating their impossible capabilities. All ships, this is Martinez, came the Admiral's voice across all channels. Time for the fun part. Execute Operation Madhouse. Zektar had no idea what Operation Madhouse might involve, but the name itself suggested that the humans were about to escalate their already impossible tactics to new levels of incomprehensibility. Across the human fleet, ships began to move in patterns that looked like complete pandemonium. Vessels that had been working together suddenly scattered in all directions, apparently abandoning any pretense of coordinated tactics. Some ships accelerated directly toward the largest Zarathi vessels, others began flying in patterns that seemed designed to attract maximum enemy fire, and several appeared to be retreating from the battle entirely. The Zarathi response was to regroup and focus their fire on the ships that appeared to be making themselves vulnerable. It was a logical response that should have resulted in the systematic destruction of the scattered human forces. Instead, it walked directly into the most sophisticated trap Zectar had ever witnessed. The ships that appeared to be retreating had actually positioned themselves to cut off Zarathi escape routes. The vessels that seemed to be making themselves vulnerable were actually baiting enemy fire away from a group of human ships that had somehow managed to approach the Zarathi command vessel undetected. And the ships that looked like they were engaging in suicidal attacks were actually creating exactly the kind of chaos needed to prevent the enemy from recognizing the trap until it was too late. They coordinated a fleet-wide deception operation without any apparent communication, Thrix observed, her mechanical voice carrying overtones of something that might have been awe if machines could experience such emotions. The level of intuitive tactical understanding required to execute something like this is unprecedented. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. As the human ships closed with their targets and the true scope of their tactical deception became clear, Zectar realized that the humans had been holding back throughout the entire engagement. Everything he had witnessed so far, the impossible maneuvers, the environmental manipulation, the coordinated chaos, had been the equivalent of warming up. Now he was about to see what humans could really do when they stopped playing around and decided to win a battle. The first sign came when the human ship's external lighting system suddenly changed from the blazing illumination they had maintained throughout the battle to something that could only be described as predatory. Instead of broadcasting their positions, the lights began to create patterns that seemed designed to confuse and disorient anyone looking at them. The second sign was the music. The aggressive vocalizations and emotional communication that had characterized human battlefield chatter suddenly gave way to something that Zectar's translator identified as coordinated rhythmic auditory patterns with aggressive undertones. But calling it music was like calling a plasma cannon a light source, technically accurate but missing the essential nature of the phenomenon. The sounds coming from the human fleet created harmonics that resonated through the metal hulls of ships across the battlefield. The rhythm was complex but hypnotic, and somehow it seemed to be synchronizing the movements of every human vessel in a way that turned the entire fleet into components of a single massive organism.
What is that sound doing to them? Thrix asked, her sensors detecting energy patterns that didn't correspond to any known weapon or technology.
It's not technology, Zectar realized.
It's biology. They're using auditory stimulation to synchronize their nervous systems across the entire fleet.
Every human pilot, gunner, and engineer is now operating on the same biological rhythm. What happened next would haunt Zectar's dreams for the rest of his very long life. The human fleet, moving in perfect synchronization despite being scattered across millions of cubic kilometers of space, turned toward the Zarathi formation and charged. Not the wild, undisciplined charge he had witnessed at the beginning of the battle, but something far more terrifying, a coordinated assault by creatures who had just demonstrated that they could function as a single predatory organism when the situation required it. The Zarathi never had a chance. The synchronized charge of the human fleet created something that Zectar's instruments had never been designed to measure, a psychological weapon that operated on frequencies deeper than consciousness. As the human ships moved in perfect harmony, their combined engine signatures created a low-frequency pulse that seemed to resonate through the quantum fabric of space itself. The Zarathi response was immediate and telling. Their crystal formations, which had maintained perfect geometric precision throughout the battle, began to show signs of structural stress. Not physical stress, their ships were still undamaged, but something far more fundamental. The mathematical certainty that formed the foundation of Zarathi thinking was being challenged by the presence of something that operated outside the realm of logic and calculation. Their formation is destabilizing, reported Thrix, her mechanical voice carrying undertones of confusion. But our sensors show no weapon impacts or system failures. The Zarathi ships are still fully functional, but their pilots are making navigation errors that suggest cognitive impairment. Zectar focused his compound eyes on the tactical display, watching as the Zarathi fleet began to show the first signs of something he had never seen in 3 centuries of military observation: fear. The crystal ships were still following their programmed tactical responses, but there was a hesitancy in their movements, a fractional delay in their decision-making that suggested their crews were experiencing something that mathematical thinking couldn't process. The human fleet reached optimal firing range and unleashed a coordinated barrage that defied every principle of space combat Zektar had ever studied. Instead of concentrating fire on the largest targets or attempting to disable enemy weapons systems, they targeted what appeared to be completely random sections of the Zarathi ship's hulls. The kinetic projectiles struck crystal surfaces that should have been heavily armored, but somehow each impact found exactly the right angle to create cascading structural failures. They're targeting resonance frequencies, Zektar realized, his mandibles clicking rapidly as he processed the impossible implications. They're using kinetic weapons to create harmonic vibrations in the crystal matrix of the enemy hulls. How could they possibly know the resonance frequencies of Zarathi construction materials? Admiral Martinez's voice came through the communication channel, but now it carried a different quality, something that Zektar's translator identified as focused predatory satisfaction. Observer, you're thinking like an engineer. We're not calculating resonance frequencies. We're listening to the music the crystals make when we hit them, and then, we're hitting them harder until they sing the note we want. The implications of that statement hit Zektar like a quantum torpedo. Humans were using auditory processing, the same biological capability that allowed them to coordinate through sound to analyze the acoustic signatures of enemy ships in real time. They were literally listening to the structural characteristics of their targets and adjusting their attacks based on what they heard. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. The most disturbing part was what happened when the first Zarathi ship began to show signs of catastrophic structural failure. Instead of continuing their systematic assault, the human ships suddenly shifted their attack pattern to something that could only be described as surgical precision. They began targeting specific systems with an accuracy that suggested they had somehow mapped the internal structure of every Zarathi vessel in the fleet. How are they achieving that targeting accuracy? Demanded Thrix. They have no access to Zarathi ship schematics, no advanced sensor systems capable of penetrating crystal hulls, and their weapon systems are too primitive for precision strikes at this range. The answer came from an unexpected source. One of the human fighters had apparently drifted close enough to their observation post for detailed scanning, and Zektar's sensors were detecting something that made his breathing apparatus work overtime again. Thrix, are you reading these biosignatures from the human fighter? Confirmed, replied Thrix, her mechanical voice carrying notes of disbelief. The pilot's nervous system is operating at activity levels that should result in immediate neurological failure. Brainwave patterns indicate simultaneous processing of multiple complex data streams at rates that exceed the theoretical maximum for biological neural networks. But the readings were even more disturbing than that. The human pilot wasn't just processing multiple data streams, they were processing sensory information that their ship's instruments weren't even designed to detect. Somehow, the pilot was using their biological nervous system to directly perceive electromagnetic signatures, gravitational fluctuations, and quantum field variations that should have required advanced scientific equipment to measure. They're evolved for this, Zektar whispered, the full implications of his observation hitting him like a revelation that changed everything he thought he understood about intelligent life. Humans didn't develop space combat tactics by studying military theory. They're using hunting instincts that evolved over millions of years on a planet where survival required the ability to track, predict, and kill prey that was faster, stronger, and better armed than they were. The battle was demonstrating this principle with terrifying clarity. Every human pilot was simultaneously tracking multiple enemy ships, predicting their movements based on subtle behavioral cues, and coordinating with their fellow hunters without conscious communication. They were functioning exactly like a pack of persistence predators that had cornered a herd of prey. And the Zarathi, for all their technological superiority and mathematical precision, were responding exactly like prey animals. Their formation was collapsing not because of weapon damage, but because their crews were experiencing something that their logical, crystal-based thinking couldn't process, the presence of predators that operated on instinctual levels that bypassed rational analysis. The Zarathi had built their entire civilization on the foundation of logical problem-solving, but humans had just presented them with a problem that couldn't be solved through logic. Observer Zektar, came Admiral Martinez's voice again, you might want to document what happens next.
This is the part where we stop being nice about it.
Zektar didn't understand what the Admiral meant until he saw the human fleet's next maneuver.
Up until this point, the humans had been engaging in what they apparently considered restrained combat.
They had been using their natural advantages while still operating within the general framework of space warfare as understood by galactic civilization.
Now they abandoned that framework entirely.
The human ships suddenly began to move in patterns that violated not just military doctrine, but the basic principles of physics as understood by every spacefaring species. Vessels that should have been limited by their technological capabilities began executing maneuvers that seemed to ignore conservation of momentum, gravitational effects, and the structural limitations of their own hulls.
This is impossible, Thrix stated flatly.
They're achieving acceleration rates that should tear their ships apart. Their hulls are registering stress levels that exceed the failure points of their construction materials, but they're not breaking.
But Zektar was beginning to understand. It's not impossible if you don't think it's impossible. Humans aren't limited by what their technology should be capable of because they're using their technology beyond design specifications. They're pushing every system past theoretical limits because their survival instincts are overriding their logical understanding of mechanical constraints.
A human destroyer executed a turn that should have generated gravitational forces capable of liquefying its crew, but, instead of being destroyed, it emerged from the maneuver in perfect condition and proceeded to engage 3 Zarathi cruisers simultaneously. The pilot's biosignatures showed stress levels that should have resulted in unconsciousness, but somehow they were still flying with precision that exceeded what most species could achieve under ideal conditions.
They're not just using their ships, Zektar realized.
They're extending their biological capabilities through their technology. Every human ship is functioning as an extension of its pilot's body, responding to biological impulses rather than mechanical inputs. This revelation explained the impossible coordination he had been witnessing.
The human fleet wasn't operating as a collection of individual vessels following tactical doctrine.
It was functioning as a single distributed organism, with each ship serving as a specialized organ in a larger predatory system. And that system was now demonstrating why humans had become the dominant species on what must have been an extraordinarily dangerous planet. The Zarathi fleet, despite its technological superiority and numerical advantage, was being systematically dismantled by opponents who had somehow transcended the limitations of their own technology through the application of biological capabilities that defied scientific explanation. Every attempt the crystal ships made to respond to human tactics was anticipated and countered before it could be implemented. "They're not fighting a battle," Thrix observed, her mechanical voice carrying overtones that might have been awe.
"They're conducting a hunt.
Every movement, every attack, every tactical decision is designed to drive their prey toward a predetermined conclusion." But the most disturbing aspect of the human hunting pattern was its efficiency. Despite the apparent chaos and improvisation, every human action was contributing to the systematic elimination of Zarathi resistance with minimal waste of effort or resources. The humans weren't just winning the battle, they were conducting a masterclass in applied predation that was being executed with the precision of a biological instinct refined over millions of years of evolution. The first Zarathi ship to attempt retreat discovered why humans had earned their reputation as persistence predators. Instead of allowing the crystal vessel to escape, a squadron of human fighters pursued it through a series of impossible maneuvers that demonstrated their ability to track prey across multiple dimensional vectors simultaneously. The pursuit lasted exactly 47 seconds and ended with the Zarathi ship being disabled by weapon impacts that targeted its engines with surgical precision.
"They're not allowing any enemies to escape," Zektar noted. "This isn't just military engagement, it's systematic elimination of a perceived threat to their territory."
The communication channels suddenly filled with new human voices, all speaking in the emotional combat language that Zektar was beginning to recognize as something far more sophisticated than primitive aggressive vocalizations. The humans were sharing real-time tactical information through emotional communication that conveyed complex spatial relationships, threat assessments, and attack coordination faster than any technological communication system could process. "Got a big one trying to sneak around the asteroid field," came one voice.
"I see him," replied another. "Moving to intercept."
"He's scared, look at those engine emissions." Scared crystal things make mistakes, added a third voice, accompanied by what Zektar's translator identified as anticipatory satisfaction.
Let's see what kind of mistakes this one makes.
The big one turned out to be a Zarathi command ship that had been attempting to position itself for a strategic withdrawal. But the human pilots had detected its movement through what appeared to be pure instinct, and they were now coordinating to prevent its escape with the casual efficiency of experienced hunters cutting off the retreat routes of familiar prey. Zektar watched in fascination as the human ships closed on the Zarathi command vessel from multiple directions, their movements showing the kind of coordination that suggested they were somehow sharing sensory information in real time. Each pilot seemed to know exactly where their fellow hunters were positioned and what they were planning to do next, despite the apparent absence of formal communication. The Zarathi command ship, realizing it was trapped, attempted to fight its way clear using weapons systems that should have been devastatingly effective against the smaller human vessels. But the humans had apparently anticipated this response, and their evasive maneuvers suggested they had somehow predicted the exact targeting pattern the enemy would use.
They're not just reacting to enemy actions, Thrix observed.
They're predicting behavior patterns based on psychological assessment of their prey species.
How is that possible without detailed prior study of Zarathi psychology?
But Zektar was beginning to understand the most frightening aspect of human combat capabilities. They don't need to study Zarathi psychology specifically. Prey behavior follows universal patterns regardless of species. Humans have evolved to recognize and exploit those patterns in any creature they identify as food. The realization hit him with the force of a quantum detonation. Humans weren't fighting the Zarathi as equals in some kind of military engagement between peer civilizations. They had identified the crystal ships as prey animals and were now conducting a hunt using instincts that had been refined through millions of years of evolutionary pressure. And the hunt was nearly over. The Zarathi command ship's final desperate gambit revealed something about human combat psychology that Zektar found more disturbing than anything he had witnessed so far. When cornered, the crystal vessel activated what appeared to be some kind of reality distortion weapon that created spatial anomalies around its position, a technology so advanced that it existed only in theoretical mathematics among most galactic civilizations.
The human response was to fly directly into the distorted space.
They're entering a zone where the laws of physics are being actively manipulated, Thrix reported, her mechanical voice carrying frequencies that suggested her processing systems were struggling with the data. Their ship should be experiencing dimensional displacement, temporal distortion, and gravitational shear forces that would tear apart any known hull material. But, instead of being destroyed by the impossible physical conditions, the human ships began to move through the distorted space as if they were swimming through water rather than flying through reality-warping energy fields.
Their pilots seemed to be navigating by instinct, finding paths through the chaos that shouldn't have existed.
How are they surviving that environment? Demanded Zektar, watching his instruments register readings that violated several fundamental constants of the universe. Admiral Martinez's voice came through the communication channel, but now it was layered with harmonics that Zektar's translator couldn't process. The human admiral was apparently speaking while experiencing the same reality distortions that should have been liquefying her brain, but she sounded more focused than ever. Observer, you keep trying to understand us with logic.
But evolution doesn't care about logic.
Earth was a planet where the laws of physics got bent on a regular basis: magnetic field reversals, gravitational anomalies, quantum storms. Humans learned to navigate impossible conditions because impossible conditions were just Tuesday afternoon on our home world. The implications of that statement rewrote everything Zektar thought he knew about planetary development and biological evolution. Most intelligent species evolved on stable worlds with predictable physical laws. Humans had apparently evolved on a planet where reality itself was variable, which had given them nervous systems capable of functioning when the universe stopped making sense. But the most terrifying demonstration of human capabilities was yet to come. As the human ships moved deeper into the reality-distorted zone around the Zarathi command vessel, they began to coordinate their movements in ways that suggested they were using the spatial anomalies as tactical advantages. Instead of fighting against the distorted physics, they were somehow incorporating the changing laws of reality into their attack patterns. A human cruiser suddenly accelerated through what appeared to be a temporal distortion field, emerging on the other side of the Zarathi ship before the crystal vessel's targeting systems could track the movement.
Another ship used a gravitational anomaly to change direction in ways that should have required more energy than its engines could possibly generate. "They're not just surviving the reality distortions," Zektar whispered. "They're using them as weapons."
The hunt was entering its final phase, and the humans were demonstrating capabilities that transcended anything in his experience of galactic warfare. They weren't just superior fighters, they were beings who had evolved to thrive in conditions that would destroy other forms of intelligent life. The Zarathi command ship made one final attempt to escape, activating what appeared to be an emergency hyperspace jump system. The energy signatures were unlike anything in Zektar's databases. The crystal vessel was apparently capable of entering hyperspace without the usual preparation time, creating an instant escape route that should have guaranteed its survival. But the human fighters were already moving to intercept trajectories that wouldn't exist until the hyperspace jump was completed.
"Impossible," breathed Thrix.
"They're predicting the exit vector of a hyperspace jump before the jump has been initiated. The calculations required to determine emergence coordinates are beyond the capabilities of most galactic civilizations, and they're doing it in real time during combat." But Zektar was beginning to understand that the humans weren't calculating anything. They're not predicting the jump vector through mathematics. They're reading the behavioral patterns of cornered prey. Every species follows the same escape protocols. When faced with extinction, they run for the safest available territory.
Humans have evolved to know where that territory will be.
The Zarathi ship completed its hyperspace jump, vanishing from normal space in a burst of exotic energy. For exactly 2.3 seconds, the crystal vessel existed in a dimension where human weapons couldn't reach it. Then, it emerged from hyperspace directly into a crossfire pattern that the human ships had established at the predicted exit point. The end came with shocking swiftness. The Zarathi command vessel, its reality distortion weapons exhausted and its escape routes blocked, found itself facing the concentrated firepower of the entire human fleet. But, instead of destroying it with overwhelming force, the humans demonstrated something that would haunt Zektar's nightmares for centuries to come. They disabled it with surgical precision, targeting specific systems to ensure the ship remained intact while becoming completely helpless. The crystal vessel hung in space like a wounded animal surrounded by patient hunters, its weapons offline, its engines disabled, its communication systems severed.
"Why aren't they finishing it?" Thrix asked.
The answer came from Admiral Martinez, her voice now carrying tones that Zektar's translator identified as something that might have been compassion mixed with inexorable purpose. "Because we need to send a message, observer. The Zarathi collective needs to understand what happens when you threaten human space."
What happened next would be discussed in galactic military academies for generations.
Instead of destroying the helpless command ship, the human fleet began to systematically capture the remaining Zarathi vessels. Not through boarding actions or technological warfare, but through psychological pressure that demonstrated their absolute superiority in ways that mere destruction could never achieve.
Human ships positioned themselves around each crystal vessel in formations that prevented escape while avoiding direct confrontation.
The Zarathi crews, watching their command structure collapse and their technological advantages prove useless, began to surrender one by one. But the humans weren't accepting surrenders, they were simply waiting, like predators who had surrounded their prey and were allowing the reality of the situation to sink in.
"They're demonstrating mercy," Zektar realized.
But it's the mercy of apex predators who are confident enough in their dominance that they don't need to kill everything they defeat. The psychological impact on the Zarathi was devastating. Their entire civilization was built on the principle of mathematical superiority, the belief that logical thinking and technological advancement would always triumph over primitive instincts and biological limitations.
The humans had just proved that principle catastrophically wrong.
But the most profound moment came when the human fleet established communication with the disabled Zarathi command ship. Instead of demanding surrender or threatening destruction, Admiral Martinez opened a channel that broadcast across all frequencies. Zarathi Collective, her voice carried the calm confidence of a predator who had finished hunting and was now ready to negotiate. "You've seen what we can do. Your ships are faster than ours, your weapons are more powerful, your technology is more advanced. But you're still sitting helpless in space while we decide what happens next."
Do you understand why?
The response came after a long pause, in the crystal harmonics that served as the Zarathi communication method. But Zektar's translator was able to convert the mathematical tones into words that carried unmistakable overtones of shock and bewilderment.
Your tactics are impossible.
Your capabilities exceed your technology. Your coordination transcends your communication systems.
We cannot compute the variables that determine your success.
That's because you're trying to solve us like an equation, Martinez replied. But we're not a problem to be solved. We're a species that learned to hunt things that were bigger, faster, stronger, and smarter than we were. The only equation that matters is simple: you came to our territory, you threatened our people, and now you understand what that means.
The Zarathi commander's response revealed the depth of their psychological defeat. What do you want from us?
We want you to go home, Martinez said simply. We want you to tell every species in your collective what you learned here today. We want the word to spread that humans are not prey animals, and our space is not hunting territory for anyone else. But then, her voice hardened, carrying undertones that made Zektar's breathing apparatus work overtime again.
And if you or anyone else decides to test that lesson, we'll be waiting. We'll always be waiting.
Because this is what we are, and this is what we do.
The formal surrender came 23 minutes later.
The entire Zarathi invasion fleet, 67 heavy cruisers, 23 dreadnoughts, and a command ship that represented the technological pinnacle of crystal-based civilization, surrendered to a human force that should have been annihilated in the first 14 minutes of combat.
But surrender wasn't the end of the lesson the humans were teaching.
Instead of taking prisoners or claiming salvage rights, the human fleet did something that would become legendary throughout galactic civilization. They escorted the Zarathi ships to the edge of human space, providing them with fuel and supplies for the journey home, while making it absolutely clear that this courtesy was being extended by choice rather than obligation. We're not keeping your ships, Martinez explained to the Zarathi commander.
We're not taking your people prisoner. We're not demanding tribute or territory.
We're just making sure you understand that this kindness is something we're choosing to give you.
Remember that when you tell the story of what happened here.
As the defeated Zarathi fleet began its long journey home, Zektar found himself processing the most complex set of observations in his 3 centuries of military documentation. He had witnessed something that challenged every fundamental assumption about the nature of warfare, the relationship between technology and victory, and the role of biological evolution in determining the outcome of conflicts between advanced civilizations. But the most profound realization was still to come. As the human fleet regrouped and began to return to their patrol routes, Zektar noticed something that sent electrical discharges of comprehension through his nervous system.
The humans weren't celebrating.
They weren't broadcasting victory messages or engaging in the kind of post-battle emotional release that most species experienced after surviving combat. Instead, they were returning to their normal duties with the calm efficiency of predators who had simply completed another successful hunt. To them, the complete defeat of a technologically superior invasion force wasn't a momentous victory to be celebrated.
It was Tuesday.
And that, Zektar realized, was perhaps the most frightening thing of all. 3 days after the battle, Zektar sat in his observation chamber aboard the Silent Observer, staring at data files that contained information capable of rewriting the strategic doctrine of every military force in the galaxy.
But he wasn't reviewing tactical recordings or weapons analysis.
Instead, he was studying the medical scans his sensors had taken of human crew members during and after the engagement. The biological data revealed something that made his understanding of the battle even more disturbing. Thrix, he called to his companion, review these bio readings from the human pilots during the final phase of combat. The mechanical being processed the data with her usual efficiency, but her response carried overtones that suggested even her artificial intelligence was struggling with the implications. Observer Zektar, these readings indicate that the human nervous systems were operating in a state that should have resulted in permanent neurological damage. Brain activity levels were sustained at rates that exceed the theoretical maximums for biological neural networks, while stress hormone concentrations reached levels that should have caused immediate system failure.
Continue, Zektar prompted.
More disturbing, the readings suggest that these extreme physiological states were not emergency responses to crisis situations. The humans appear to have been operating in enhanced biological modes as a matter of routine combat protocol. They were deliberately pushing their nervous systems beyond normal limitations because they had evolved mechanisms for surviving the consequences.
Zektar's mandibles clicked rapidly as he processed this information. They weren't fighting at their maximum capability during the battle.
They were operating in what they consider normal combat condition.
The implications were staggering.
Every military analysis of human capabilities that had been conducted by Galactic Intelligence Services was based on observations of humans operating in what they apparently considered restrained circumstances.
No one had documented what happened when they stopped holding back.
But the medical data revealed an even more profound truth.
The human nervous system wasn't just adapted for extreme combat conditions, it was designed to improve under stress.
While other species experienced degraded performance when faced with mortal danger, humans became more capable, more coordinated, and more effective as the stakes increased.
Observer Zektar, came Admiral Martinez's voice through the communication system, we're preparing to return to patrol duty. Thank you for documenting the engagement.
Your records will help us understand how we can improve our performance next time.
Improve? Zektar couldn't keep the bewilderment out of his voice. Admiral, you achieved complete victory against overwhelming odds using tactics that defied every principle of military science. How could your performance be improved?
There was a pause, followed by that distinctive human laughter that Zektar was beginning to recognize as a sign of cognitive processing that operated on levels his species couldn't understand. Observer, that wasn't our best work. We were being careful because we knew you were watching, and we didn't want to do anything that might scare our galactic neighbors too badly.
Next time we might not have to worry about diplomatic considerations.
The communication ended, leaving Zektar staring at his instruments in a state of mental paralysis that his species experienced when encountering information that fundamentally challenged their understanding of reality. The humans had been restraining themselves. Everything he had witnessed, the impossible maneuvers, the reality-defying tactics, the predatory coordination that had dismantled a technologically superior force, had been accomplished by humans who were deliberately limiting their capabilities to avoid frightening their galactic allies.
Thrix, he said slowly, I need you to run a projection. If the biological capabilities we documented represent restrained human performance, what would unrestricted human combat look like?
The mechanical being processed the request for several minutes before responding.
Observer Zektar, I cannot complete that projection.
The extrapolated capabilities exceed the parameters of my tactical modeling systems.
Based on the data we collected, humans operating without restraint would possess compatibilities that are indistinguishable from the theoretical capabilities of the ancient architects.
Zektar felt his breathing apparatus begin to work overtime again. The ancient architects were the mythical beings who had supposedly built the galaxy's transportation networks and communication systems before vanishing millions of years ago. They were considered to be the theoretical pinnacle of technological and military evolution. But the humans weren't achieving their impossible feats through technology. They were doing it through biology that had evolved on a planet where survival required capabilities that other species considered mythical.
A new communications signal interrupted his thoughts. This time the source wasn't Admiral Martinez, it was a transmission from the Vorthak Observation Corps headquarters, broadcasting on emergency frequencies. Observer Zektar, priority communication from Director Velthak. Respond immediately.
Zektar activated the communication channel, his compound eyes adjusting to focus on the holographic image of his superior officer. Director Velthak's normally composed features showed signs of stress that Zektar had never seen before.
Observer Zektar, we have received preliminary reports of your documentation from the Kepler's Edge engagement. Before you submit your final analysis, I need to inform you of developments that may influence your conclusions. What developments, Director? 3 hours ago, the Hegemony Council received a formal communication from the Zarathi Collective.
They are requesting immediate negotiations for a non-aggression treaty with the human territories. Additionally, 7 other major powers have submitted similar requests through diplomatic channels. Zektar felt his mandibles begin clicking uncontrollably.
Director, the humans won a single engagement against a Zarathi invasion force.
Surely that doesn't justify such extreme diplomatic responses from multiple civilizations.
Observer Zektar, the Zarathi didn't just request a treaty.
They surrendered their territorial claims to 17 star systems that they had conquered over the past decade. They are offering to return those systems to their original inhabitants as part of their agreement with humanity. The information hit Zektar like a quantum detonation. The Zarathi collective had built their entire expansion strategy on the principle that technological superiority guaranteed military victory. They had conquered those systems after systematic campaigns that had demonstrated their overwhelming advantages over the indigenous populations. Now they were abandoning those conquests because they had encountered an opponent who had proved that technological superiority meant nothing against sufficiently evolved biological capabilities.
Director, what are the strategic implications of this development?
Observer Zektar, every major military power in the galaxy is currently reassessing their fundamental assumptions about warfare. The humans have demonstrated capabilities that suggest they could defeat any known military force using technologies that are considered primitive by galactic standards. The balance of power has shifted in ways that our strategic models cannot predict. But Director Velthak wasn't finished delivering disturbing news. Additionally, observer, we have received reports from monitoring stations throughout the galaxy indicating unusual activity in previously conquered territories. Indigenous populations that had accepted occupation by technologically superior forces are beginning to organize resistance movements. The word is spreading that technological dominance can be overcome through proper application of biological advantages. Zektar realized he was witnessing the beginning of something that would reshape galactic civilization. The humans hadn't just won a battle, they had shattered the fundamental assumption that had governed interstellar politics for millennia. The belief that advanced technology guaranteed military superiority was crumbling, and every oppressed population in the galaxy was beginning to reconsider their situation.
Director, what are my orders regarding the final documentation? Complete your analysis, Observer Zektar.
But understand that your report will be classified at the highest levels and distributed only to the Galactic Defense Council.